I want to introduce our speakers today, and we have Erica Moore from the, I'm not saying the correct name of the area office, but it's out in Framingham, and she's a transition coordinator. We also have John Cruz, who's from the Merrimack Valley, a transition coordinator up in the Merrimack Valley DDS office. We also have Aaron Hubley from the Plymouth area office. We have a recording of Lauren King from the Metro North area office talking a little bit about COVID and that sort of thing. And then we also have, the self-direction manager from the Framingham office, which is very exciting because, you know, while this has been a challenging year, there has been some interesting outcomes. So we're going to be hearing about a couple of options that people have been looking at to try to get through this COVID period. So without further ado, I am going to change a slide. Up here is all our website information. So if you need any of that. I'm still letting people in the waiting room, so sorry, I'm a little slower. Trying to change my slide here and it's not letting me change, excuse me. Okay, so what are we going to cover today? Well, we're going to cover a little bit about what is the role of the DDS Transition Coordinator? What are they supposed to be doing? You know, what does their job look like? You know, regardless of COVID, what is their role in providing transition services? What's Chapter 688? Just, I know many of you probably know about Chapter 688, but incredibly important legislation that was, you know, done many, many years ago that helped with planning and also, you know, notification of a young adult who is about to enter a system. And how can families, students, and schools work together with the transition coordinator? How do we collaborate? What's a good, appropriate transition timeline? When should you start to worry, and when, you know, what years do you do what? What makes for a strong transition? What does that look like? You know, transition, I want to quote Jennifer Stewart, who used to be the transition director at Mass Rehab Commission. And for a number of years, and I'll never forget when she said this, she said, you know, transition isn't a meeting, it's a process. So it's a, you know, just a good way of looking at transition. How has COVID impacted it? And another thing happening in Massachusetts is the Charting the Life course has become a little bit more predominant, which is a framework and a tool through the University of Missouri out at Kansas City. And it's a wonderful framework for looking at, you know, really planning for what that good life looks like, or what does life after high school look like. And then we want to look at a little bit about the highlights that have happened during transition. We've all had to think much more out of the box. And sometimes out of the box thinking isn't right for everybody. But what it has done is really put together more options, I think, for people. You know, we'll be hearing a lot more about this. So next slide. So, you know, it's kind of apropos that, you know, about a year ago, we were in lockdown. Programs, you know, they were closed. You know, I think at this point last year, everybody was scrambling for PPE and toilet paper. You go to the grocery store and you couldn't get those. You couldn't get hand sanitizers or cleaners or anything like that. So it's certainly put everybody in a, you know, in a, you know, a loop. real impact on families, as you know. A lot of caregivers having to juggle working from home, homeschooling their kids, getting to make sure that students and young and adults that we support have access to technology. Virtual programming became much more of a thing. Waiting for direction from the CDC, through the governor's office, the COVID response team, and then finally coming down to DDS, and then DDS providing messaging throughout the state to families as well as providers. So just, no one's ever gone through this before. So it was trial and error. Then the whole social distancing and wearing masks and hand sanitizing and, how do you get your young adults doing that? That sort of thing. So anyways, we seem to be moving forward. Certainly there was, we were stuck for a while. There's no nothing, no magic there. But seems like programs are opening up more. People are taking advantage of some other types of resources. I'm not sure, but it's probably going to be a while before things like transportation are back to normal as
Shenanigan
well, programs. But
that's out of place.
Anyways, that's kind of where we're at. So, we're hopeful there's more vaccinations. Governor Baker this morning, I was thrilled to hear, said that anybody who wants a vaccine can schedule themselves anytime after April 19th, because for the most part, unless you were listed on that comorbid, list, you were pretty much restricted in terms of age or in a congregate care setting, and that sort of thing. So a lot of the families who have their loved ones at home, who did not meet any of the comorbid conditions, have not been able to get a vaccine, so that seems like it's the green light again in Massachusetts. There's been a lot of advocacy to convince the governor, so I'm glad things are finally happening. So let me advance this slide. So I think this is Erica. Erica, you're gonna take over here?
Sure. Hi, Carrie. How are you? Good afternoon to everybody. And that is such good news. I didn't hear the governor this morning. So that sounds like a month from Friday, everyone will be able to get a vaccine if they want one. So that's super to hear. So I'm really glad to be talking about transition because it is one of my favorite things, being a transition coordinator. So I'm going to cover today just what our role is, and then I'm just going to talk a little bit about the 688, and then talk briefly about some of our service delivery models, because that's what transition coordinators talk about every single day. So what is the function of the role of your 688 transition coordinator? We really serve as a link, like an informational conduit to families, and we talk a lot about what services can be provided based on need and availability once an individual turns 22. So we'll stay with you and we'll plan with you, and we'll work with your vision, and we'll work with your student until 22. And we become involved with your family once eligibility has been determined. So next, Carrie, thank you. Next on the slide, Carrie, thanks. So what we'll do is we'll meet with you once your individual has been made eligible, and then we'll look to schedule an ITP. And that ITP is a meeting where we work with your team. Often it's embedded in the IEP because you have the team together, and we all talk about what your individual would benefit from. But just like Carrie said about that quote earlier, transition's a process and it's not just a meeting. So other things have to happen, and big things have to happen outside of that ITP. And that really is working with you and your loved one in terms of what the vision is. And then what service model makes the most sense for you. We'll also make referrals based on the vision. And we will also, I just want to mention one other thing too. It's key to remember that, that when an individual is made eligible, that means that a 688 has come in, and then that also means that an application has been filled in and sent to the regional office. And you'll notice on the front page of the slide presentation, the application is right on there. So it's really important to remember we need both of them. It's kind of like a key and a lock. You need both of them to open up those services. Thanks, Carrie. So we'll switch over. So I wanted to spend just a little bit of time on...
Well, excuse me, Erica, can you
Sure.
define ITP?
Sure. So that's an individual transition plan. And as I mentioned earlier, a nice way to dovetail that ITP is in an IEP. So very often, and it's a good question, thank you, Carrie, very often your transition coordinator will come to that IEP. It's usually a year before an individual turns 22. Sometimes it can be a year and a half before. But in that meeting, when you have your speech and language or your PT and your OT, and you have all these specialists together, we form that ITP. And really what that means is that we've worked together, that we've sat in, that we've had a meeting, and this is one of your rights that's tied to that chapter 688. But it really just states what an individual would benefit from. It's not a service delivery page. It's not something that means that because it's on this document, those services have to happen. It's what the team feels as though the individual would benefit from. And then at that point, we have to look at what's available and then the funding. So that ITP is an individual transition plan, and that happens with your transition coordinator, and it should be happening with the team. That's the ideal way to have an ITP. Does that help clear that up, Carrie? Okay, great. So I think one of the primary roles is that information conduit, because you're leaving entitlement services and you're going into this adult world, and it's overwhelming. So what the transition coordinator really wants to do is they want to educate, they want to assist, and they want to connect families based on the vision with what services would work best. So Carrie, the next slide talks a little bit about what's our service delivery models. And we spend a lot of time talking about the vision and what the family and what the team feels as though the individual would benefit from. But then you even then have to learn, okay, so what's available, or what do adult services look like? So we kind of created some tracks to make it a little bit easier for families. And it's just like a train on a track. You're here and you want to get to another location. Another family might not want to be on that track. They might not want to be going in that direction. But I find it can be confusing and overwhelming for families when they're hearing about all of these service delivery models and then trying to figure out where they fit. So what we like to do first is find out what's the vision and what are you looking for? What track do we want to go on? Well, these tracks have changed a little bit and they've mixed up a little bit since COVID, which has actually been exciting. So track one, a good example is that traditional day program model. That's your community-based day program or your day habilitation program. It's typically a 30-hour week. It's really leaving one program, that 18 to 22 program, and going into now an adult program. But since COVID and it shut down all of our programs, we're doing a lot more in self-direction, which we'll talk about later. And we're doing a lot more in hybrid models, which is exciting. So this is going to be kind of that traditional day piece. We can look at track two, which is going to be that self-direction model. We can either self-direct and do it ourselves with a support broker at DDS, or we can have an agency help assist with that. Or we can have a hybrid model. We can do some agency with choice or some self-direction and some traditional day services. Track three would be a family where maybe their individual is already placed residentially at a NEC or a May Institute or a program like that where they're looking to request residential. Track four, we have families that are on the DESE program, and we have families that are medically fragile, and so they have additional in-home supports. And then track five, everyone probably is touching track five, But it's really important as a transition coordinator to work with the family and to work with the family support center and make sure that we're identifying all the other buckets of resources, because DDS is only one. And you're going to hear over and over again throughout this presentation that you really want to make sure that you're capitalizing and that you're utilizing all of these other arms. So track 5 is looking at what can other agencies do. There's SSI, there's the Metro West Center for Independent Living, there's family support centers, there's Mass Health, and many other agencies. So that's kind of what that's the primary function, to make sure that we land in a spot at 22 or when your individual graduates where we've heard the vision, we've captured that vision, and that we've created a successful transition plan based on the service delivery models. Next, Carrie, thank you. So what is a Chapter 688?
Yeah, and Erica,
Yep.
In the chat, there was a suggestion that we talk about the difference between eligibility and 688.
Okay,
so that just, because that can be confusing.
Exactly, and it actually dovetails right into what is the Chapter 688. This is a key point. The Chapter 688 comes from the school, and that means that the school's identified, and we'll use DDS as an example, but the school can identify they can identify Mass Rehabilitation Commission. But for the sake of our conversation today, we're going to say that a 688 was signed by you through your school, and they've chosen DDS, and they've said that this individual is receiving, IEP services, and they're choosing DDS to be the lead agency and to walk with you until that individual turns 22 to create a transition. So that unlocks your right. That allows us, for one, it's also a release of information. So that allows us to get all the information about your loved one. 2, that allows us to talk with the school. 3, it enables an ITP. It allows for that to happen. And then 4, it also goes to DDS. And so that starts a path with DDS. And so once DDS is notified and they receive this 688, there'll be a letter and an application sent to the family's home. And they will continue to send a letter for a certain amount of time requesting an application. So here's the important part. If you have a 688, that does not mean that eligibility has been determined. Eligibility is determined when the application is received, intake and eligibility has determined that the individual is eligible. That's when an individual becomes eligible. So a family does not need to wait for 688 to be submitted. As a matter of fact, I highly recommend that they send it at 18 years old. Fill out the application. It's on the front slide. It's on our website. So you want to really fill out that application. The 688, that's coming from the school. And when we put the two together, that's when we have, our transition. We have, the school's identified that this individual is looking for potentially DDS services. And so I'll actually cover exactly what the 688. So you need to be, in order for 688 for you to enact a 688, you need to be receiving special education. And then there needs to be a need for that continuing education post 22. An individual that is automatically eligible for Chapter 688 is if they're receiving SSI or SSDI, or they're registered with the Mass Commission for the Blind. But remember, that does not mean that they're eligible for DDS services. That only means that they're eligible for the 688. So we need both in order to get going. Does that make sense, Carrie? Okay, awesome. So we'll switch over now. I think that this is going to go to Aaron on the transition timeline. Thank you.
Thanks, Erica. Hi, everyone. My name is Aaron Hubley, as Carrie mentioned, and I am the Transition Service Coordinator for the Plymouth area DDS office, part of the Southeast region. So before I get going here, I'm going to be presenting and going through 2 different slides. The first is really a timeline, a blueprint, a cheat sheet, whatever you guys want to call it. But it's a roadmap, and I think it's a good roadmap because it directly corresponds with ages of your loved one, your student, and sort of some different action steps and things that you should start to think about in relation to that age. So before I kind of get going with the transition timeline, I do want to mention that this timeline is relative to your specific student and your specific loved one and their specific track. And what I mean by that is we've outlined this transition timeline here. And as you can see, it goes from ages 14 to 22. It's really important to understand, that we talk about the Chapter 688 law, or the Turning 22 law, as we kind of lovingly refer to it sometimes. And that's because historically DDS has supported folks with intellectual disabilities, and henceforth there's an entitlement for them to be able to stay in school-based programming until 22. However, for the better part of the last decade, we've also been supporting people on the autism spectrum as well. And obviously autism and intellectual disability are two very different diagnoses. So given that we are now supporting folks that have a higher IQ but are also on the spectrum, it's important to understand that this timeline in terms of the ages may not pertain directly, but the action steps still apply, meaning that if you have a loved one with autism, they may be on track to receive a diploma and graduate at age 18 rather than staying in school until 22. But that still means they could potentially be eligible for DDS services under our autism division. So I know, again, that can be very confusing. And one of the points I'm going to make in my next slide is don't be afraid to ask questions. But again, we'll take it one slide at a time. And again, this is just a generalized timeline, this first slide, and then the next slide is sort of how everything comes together and sort of really important takeaways. But again, I think one of the important takeaways from this presentation as a whole is get acquainted with this slide, as again, it really is a great cheat sheet as to what you might need to start thinking about for your loved one. So I can kind of just loosely go through the slide. And Carrie, stop me at any point if anything kind of pops up, or if people have questions, or if anything needs further clarification from where you sit. But I'll kind of loosely go through this slide just so everyone kind of has an idea of some important things to hit upon. So transition in Massachusetts technically starts at age 14. And I'm sure a lot of people are thinking, wow, that's super early. But I think Erica, John, and everyone else here might agree that I don't think it's ever too early for transition to start, at least from an information gathering and education perspective. And I'm really going to drive home what Erica said. We are very much, in fact, information conduits. I think a prerequisite of the job is just being able to spew lots of different information. We love to hear ourselves talk, so please ask us questions. But anyway, at age 14, it's really important just to start to talk to your students' school, whether that's an in-district school program, a residential school, whoever. It's important to really start talking to your students' team about what does transition look like for that particular school district or school. Who are some people that we should be inviting to the table for future meetings and things like that? Really just start to scratch the surface. Talk to those school personnel. I will tell you, at every school, again, whether it's an in-district program or a residential school, typically there's a person, one professional within that system that's earmarked as sort of a transition specialist that sort of dabbles both in the school and adult world, kind of like we do as transition coordinators. So they should have a pretty good idea of the next step, and it should be enough to kind of whet your palate and prepare you for kind of what you can expect and what the landscape might look like. So talk to your team and sort of identify who that person is at the school. That way you can, again, start to scratch the surface of all this. And start to take a look at your student's IEP, because as Erica mentioned, the IEP, over time will evolve. And it'll go from a more education-based focus to a more sort of vocational-based focus.
So far, very basic. I already know all this stuff, Dave.
So what we can do too is we can kind of go on and talk about kind of what happens next. We can kind of skip through again. When you're talking about IEP goals and objectives, again, the IEP is going to evolve as your student evolves. And again, there'll be more of a vocational focus on that. So when you get to about, you have about 2 years, ages 14 to 16, it kind of gives you a chance to dabble, start to collect information. Really, when you get to I would say age 17 is really kind of when the rubber starts to meet the road a little bit, and you kind of need to start doing some action steps. So Erica had talked about a Chapter 688 referral. So this, at age 17, it would be a really good time to ensure that you as parents and guardians are really kind of talking with your school and making sure there's a point person at the school who's submitting a 688. And for all intents and purposes for this conversation, we can kind of assume that that 688 is going to go to DDS as sort of the lead agency. But understand, again, specific to your student, there could very possibly be other agencies at the table, which is kind of one of the points that we'll cover in the next slide. The 688 application is a very important school-based document that comes to us. But again, as Erica mentioned, you need the 688 referral, and then you also need the DDS adult eligibility, whether that's through the intellectual disability track or the autism track. So you need both of those to capture any adult services. So again, the 688, the DDS adult eligibility application. So that's a good time. Like I said, 17 and a half is a really good time to kind of get going on those types of things. And again, for those families who are supporting a loved one with autism who plans on leaving high school earlier, around age 18, if they're going to graduate with a diploma, you can kind of fast forward a little bit of this and just make sure some of these action steps are done a little bit ahead of time. Now, I would say age 18 is really kind of when things start to pick up from a transition perspective. Once someone is DDS eligible, what's going to happen is that's when a transition coordinator like myself, like Erica, like John, can start to kind of get involved, more involved, I should say, with your student. We can start attending some school-based meetings. And again, it's really important just to kind of connect the dots and make sure if you feel as though you're not connected to someone at DDS, please, and again, if someone at the school really can't point you in the right direction, an easy way to kind of figure out where you would need to go, you can log on to our website, mass.gov, and you can type in DDS in the search bar. And then within that search bar, one of the links that's going to pop up is find a local area office. And so you can pop in whatever city or town you live in, and it'll tell you which area office your town's catchment falls into. So, and then when that information pops up, it'll also pop up with information on names and phone numbers of whom you can contact. One of those contacts will actually be the transition coordinator. So again, just a little bit of information. If you really don't know where to go, or if your school can't point you in the right direction, just log on to that website, and then you'll be able to kind of find out who you need to talk to for yourself. So again, at ages 18, 19, this is really sort of a switch. Again, I mentioned sort of shifting focus from an education focus to a more vocational focus. So a lot of the school programs in Massachusetts around age 18, when typical high school tenure would end for most students. For those kiddos who are staying on until 22, or maybe another year or two, or what have you, there's typically a shift to a more vocational focus. So there's typically a program change. And again, so they're not folks typically, and students won't be in education-based services. They'll still be under the school umbrella, but they'll be in a different program, some kind of post-grad program that really focuses on community integration, work skill building, sort of those types of things. And really, these type of post-grad programs kind of provide a really good look as to what some of the things that adult services will focus on. Erica mentioned earlier community-based day support programs and things like that. I always refer to these post-grad programs as sort of the little sister of our community-based programs, because a lot of the times they're sort of working on a lot of the same things. But anyway, this will kind of be a dramatic shift, I think, for most families in the way that they're approaching their students' education. But, go with the flow. And again, where these programs are sort of set up to sort of set your students up for life. So, it's important, again, at these meetings, just ensure that, you've got a transition specialist from the school there, ensure that there's a DDS transition coordinator there. And again, please always call us. Like I said, you can log on to the website, you can get telephone and name information there, and you can always call us. I mean, you don't know what you don't know. And opportunities like this are great, but you can only get so much information across in an hour. So please just give us a call. Let us know how we can be helpful. So you make your way down the timeline a little bit more, and you get to sort of the ages of between 20 and 22. And really by this time, this is when sort of the DDS eligibility should be done if your student is staying in school until 22. So you really want the eligibility done. You want to make sure that the 688 is completed. And you also want to make sure that sort of some things that are hanging on the periphery are completed, but aren't necessarily directly DDS processes. And I'm talking about things like Social Security, Mass Health, all of these other sort of ducks that you want to make sure you get in a row prior to your student turning 22. Just because, like I said, you know, if you can be proactive and you can make things easier for yourself, you know, that's always something that I think Erica, John, and myself would suggest to people. So again, you know, really, once you get to 21, 22, you should have a very familiar relationship with your transition service coordinator by then. You should be able to kind of call them, be bouncing ideas off of them, and really kind of planning for what the transition is going to look like. You know, some pen should be coming to paper. There should be some kind of documents coming out of this. Erica mentioned the ITP. That's a document that your service coordinator will draft. But really, it's about what is going to happen after high school, and what does that transition actually look like? And again, we're talking about the rubber meeting the road. So I'm not going to steal John's thunder, because he's going to talk more about person-centered planning and how it all kind of comes together. But again, that kind of gives us, I think, a pretty rough idea. And again, this timeline, I'm sorry I didn't read it word for word, but again, this gives you a really good, I think, roadmap, blueprint, cheat sheet as to kind of what the action steps are and what you need to do. And this would be a really good sort of sheet to reference when you're talking to your transition service coordinator or your children's service coordinator. Are there any questions about, Carrie, do you feel like any clarifications needed on that slide before we move on?
We do have some questions, but what I'm going to recommend, there was one around compensatory services and DDS eligibility, but what I'm going to recommend is that we take the questions at the end. So no worries, I won't forget you, and I'm keeping track on the chat. So thanks, Aaron.
No problem.
I was clicking too fast. There you go.
Great. So this next slide, again, some of this is repetitive, and I apologize for that, but really I wanted to kind of take an opportunity. I mean, the title of the slide is how we can all kind of work together. And that's obviously a really important piece of this whole thing is just making the connection. So, you know, in my tenure doing this job, I've kind of bulleted these things that I feel are very important. So the first one is obviously plan and plan early. We talked a little bit about that. I mean, transition starts at age 14. It's never too early to start to educate yourself and collect information and really understand what things are going to look like from ages 14 through 22 or through 18 or whenever it is that your student is expected to leave the school umbrella. And again, so that kind of dovetails into what you guys are doing now, educate yourself. And again, you're never going to learn everything you need to know in a 1-hour slide presentation. You know, Erica, John, and I are all experienced, but we're not that good where we can kind of tell you guys everything you need to know in an hour or an hour and a half. So again, go to these community presentations, talk to other parents within your school-based network. You know, talk to the parents of the other kids in the program, see what they're doing. It's also important to understand too, Erica hit upon a family support center service that every area has. So that's a good saving grace for a lot of people as well, and something important to know about. So our family support centers are walk-in information and referral centers. They're ran by private nonprofit agencies. There's one in every area. Sometimes there's two, depending on the area. But really get familiar. And again, this is information that your DDS Children's Coordinator, DDS Transition Coordinator, sometimes the school has this information. Get familiar and identify who and where your family support center is, because again, these centers are walk-in information and referral centers that we charge with the task of really helping folks navigate this process, this transition process. So again, it's a free service that you guys can just walk into at any point, get information. And oftentimes there's lots of other things happening on the periphery too that your child may be able to kind of patch into. So again, continue to educate yourself. So you make sure the right players are at the table. And again, depending on who that is sort of relative to where you are in that timeline. At the beginning of the process, it's mostly going to be your school personnel. But again, I'm a big believer in sort of having the larger team at the table. So if your child is receiving any in-home services, say through applied behavior analysis, ABA, or they're getting therapeutic services in some way, shape, or form, I think it's always a good idea to sort of invite those people into the IEP meetings too. Just for education generalization purposes, making sure, what happens in one setting happens in another. So, if you have those players at the table, it also really allows the school to sort of write and deliver goals that are more meaningful. So again, as you kind of go on, make sure the right players are at the table. The right players, when you get a little older, would be the transition service coordinator. There could also be other people at the table from different agencies, like Erica mentioned, the Mass Rehab Commission. That's a good example of one. Once your child gets to be a certain age, they could have representatives from an adult family care agency. So again, I think it's important to make sure, as long as you're comfortable as a family, having as many of these folks at the table as possible. That way everyone knows what everyone else is working on, and we can kind of build the most comprehensive plan possible for your student when they transition. So the next point, research, ask questions about and understand services that may be available now. And again, this is relative to your specific student, your specific district and area. But again, some examples of this could be services available through the Mass Rehab Commission for students. So an example of that would be pre-employment training services that they offer. Another service, again, could be adult family care. It just sort of depends. So again, talk to your service coordinator, talk to the school about some other services that your student may be able to capture now. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily need to wait until you're 22. And again, the Family Support Agency is a wealth of information on how you might be able to patch into other services that may or may not be available to you now. Get your ducks in a row. So this is one of my favorite sayings in this job. So I always, when I work with my families, I always say, okay, I'm going to give you my ducks in a row spiel now. And really, these are just the hard and fast action points that, if you want your loved one to possibly be able to capture adult services, these are sort of the things that you got to do. So, the ducks in a row that I tend to talk about are obviously the 688 referral being submitted by the school, the DDS adult eligibility. Those are a couple of big ones. For most folks, the transition service coordinator and family would be talking about things like SSI or SSDI, mass health eligibility, and things like that. Guardianship could be a big one, depending on your loved one's capacity. Not everyone needs or requires guardianship, but some folks do. So again, that's one of the ducks that you might want to get in a row. So again, just different points and different triggers that you might want to start thinking about. That way, when you get to that point of 17, 18, when action steps really have to happen, you'll kind of understand what needs to be done. So I probably won't have to tell you guys this next one, be the squeaky wheel. I think mostly everyone on this call who's witnessing this presentation is probably had to be a squeaky wheel for their loved one at some point in their life. So again, always, if you don't know, ask, don't be afraid. I mean, you can coordinate with DDS, you can coordinate with the school, and just, never be afraid to ask any questions that you need clarification on. I feel like you don't know what you don't know, and we are here to be information conduits, as so is the school, as so is all of these other agencies that I've previously mentioned. So we're all here to kind of help your loved one and help you and help them kind of lead the best transition that they can. And so I think, to kind of conclude, it's important to make all of these things that we're talking about manageable. And I know that kind of seems like a hard task as we're just talking and talking and talking at you, and everyone's feverishly trying to write things down and figure out, their own individuals' circumstances and what they need to do and how they can prioritize those steps. But just take it one step at a time. And again, if you don't know the answers to questions, please ask. because again, as one of the last things that I've kind of put down here, sometimes it takes 2, 3, 4, 5 times of hearing the same information for it to really sink in. I mean, transition as a whole, it is a process, as Erica had mentioned before, but it's a really anxiety-provoking process. It's a tough time, and it's not a process that only your loved one is experiencing. You guys as sort of the natural supporting family members are going through a hard time with this too. So please, I mean, if you need us to repeat information, that's not a big deal. You know, my little sister is supported by DDS, and when I was younger, when she transitioned, you know, I very much remember the anxiety. I remember the tears. I remember just the weight that we felt when she was leaving school and coming into adult services. So, you know, I can empathize with that perspective, but I do think, you know, what made all the difference for my family, for her, was being able to kind of collect the information that we needed to sort of in a proactive and manageable way. And just really establishing good working relationships with the transition folks at the school setting and sort of the folks heading up transition at the local DDS area office, and kind of coming together and making sure we're sort of airing out all of the questions that we need to, so that transition can be as less anxiety provoking as possible. And I know that kind of sounds like a crazy concept, but again, just remember to breathe, make things manageable, and just take it day by day. And that's all I've got. So Carrie, anything that needs to be clarified there?
So thank you, Erin. That was really helpful. We also want to just, we're getting lots of chats. So we will be taking time at the end of the program to answer questions. And we apologize, the timelines was kind of cut off on the bottom from the way the slides were done. So we'll send folks an actual timeline that they can read throughout. And then also I'll send you a link, everyone, to the ARC of Massachusetts transition timeline. And it actually goes from age 14 all the way to 22. And it talks a lot about the steps that Erin was doing. So thank you, Erin. So I now believe this, we're going to pass it on to John.
Hey everyone, I appreciate the questions in the chat. I'm actually copying them onto a running list so I can see all of them, and I've tried to respond to as many as I can. The last question is actually perfect in leading into what I'm talking about, is how are transition coordinators able to understand the complexities of the person they are serving, or recommending service models or agencies to based off of 1 or 2 meetings. I think this is actually the complexity of the transition coordinator role. All summed up is, we don't claim to be the experts in your son or daughter. Our role is to recommend or not necessarily recommend, but to educate you as to what's available, so that you as a family and the long-term service team can come up with a plan for us to put in place. The transition coordinators aren't really there to tell you what to do. We're here to help you make your goals a reality. So we really need to start thinking big picture and long term. Really, when we look back at the timeline that Erin represented, around 17 or 18 years old, we should be seeing a shift in IEP goals. They should go from a less formal educational goal to more functional academic goals. And then really, we want to sort of start thinking away from the IEP as families and support workers for individuals. The IEP is important, but again, this is a meeting on DDS and transition. So if we were to think about it, the IEP goals all point towards something bigger. So when I meet with families, I do not necessarily want to read your IEP goals word for word. I want to say, what do you need for your loved one or person that you care and support? What do you need to live a happy life with fulfillment, with things they enjoy, be safe and healthy? And those don't come in the form of IEP goals. The IEP goals build towards those, but I want the big picture. So we can go on to the next slide, Carrie. So once we get the big picture, then we can break that back down. We want to this time, and again, it's very individual based, and that's the beauty of DDS is we are so individual based. Is even when they write policies, it's so hard because how many times do we look at an individual and say, huh, that policy didn't address this? And even thinking of COVID and the school systems, how many policies and laws do we have in place? And then all of the pandemic happened and go, oh, we never thought of that. And now we're going back and trying our best. But again, we have positive outcomes and there's ways to get there. So we take that big dream and we break it down into chunks and what we need to get there. So we can either, look at making less goals that will lead towards more independence or more mastery level, or we can increase some goals to get more exposure to different types of environments or settings. And either of those can be totally acceptable. This is where it's really important to remember DDS is we're not the experts on your sons or daughters or the people you care for. We're part of a team that we might make some suggestions, but only based off of our expertise, which is the knowledge of our programs. It's not necessarily the knowledge of your son or daughter, but we need to take the information provided, and we do need to at some time say, this is what we have that's appropriate, because again, not necessarily, the ideal doesn't always exist. It's not that we can't get there, but again, if someone comes to me at 21 years old and comes up with a totally new service model that I've never heard of, I'm not saying that's not ideal. It could be the best thing ever, but if it doesn't exist, it's going to take some time to get us there. So again, we want to take your big dreams and break them down into little manageable goals. Again, if we're working from 18 on, that's great. Next slide, please, Carrie. Thank you. And so here, this is just something we should be thinking of, is the different roles of the transition team. And I highly suggest that for each team member, they should not wear more than 2 roles. And this is actually going even further to something I've learned personally through the pandemic is putting all of our ducks in one basket doesn't lead to positive transitions. So having individual team members or individual support agencies wear all of the hats, it really is setting us up for some hard times, whether it be a beloved transition coordinator at the school that knew all of the information, but the other team members of the IEP team weren't as caught up and that person leaves the position at the school. I've had that happen to me this year. And it's really hard to come back and pick up the pieces, whether it's your transition coordinator. We really do love the people we work with and we love our jobs, but our time in these roles is limited. So again, so I suggest that you try not to have people on your transition team have more than one role. And again, we think about it like hubs. If I were to suggest, I think you should have 2 hubs of support service. So 2 people that you funnel everything through, that they're not responsible for coming up with the plans, but they have all the information compiled together. And typically that would be a person at the school, educational team facilitator, a transition coordinator, a guidance counselor, and then your DDS support worker. So from there, I do think it's, again, Massachusetts in general is a state that's ruled by municipality. Yes, we have some overarching governing umbrellas to fall in, but there is leeway for the municipality and the regional offices and the area offices to have differences. So for families, this is my #1 suggestion. To figure out who your hub should be at an IEP meeting, ask one simple question. Do you know who the transition coordinator is that covers this area? And if they can answer that question, they have a good relationship with DDS, and that's already going to work really well together. If they cannot answer that question, if in the IEP meeting you ask, do you know who the transition coordinator is? And they say, no, we don't. We know what the office is. They typically, unfortunately, don't have a great relationship with the office, and you as the family should really be tapping into your service coordinator immediately. I think that's very important, and every transition coordinator has 1 or 2 districts that doesn't know they exist. I just think that's the reality of it, and it's unfortunate. But these are families that, if you take anything away from it, is figure out what your district's communication and collaboration with DDS is. And that's probably going to be, if you know where you're starting off their relationship and how often they work together and how well they work together, you're already ahead of, I'd say, 60% of our families. So again, these are all just examples. I tried not to put stuff too specific in here because, again, I want it to be relatively general that every family could get some sort of value out of it. So let's move on to the last part about goal planning. Other way, Carrie. All right, so let's talk SMART goals. IEPs and adult ISP, individual service plan, which is what sort of takes the places of an IEP after 22. They should be written in SMART formatting, so it's good for families to start thinking about that now. Basically, it's just specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. We should be doing this in transition planning. There's no official goals that go into transition planning. The ITP doesn't actually yield any goals, it just yields suggestions. But families should be doing this is setting a goal. And again, I would start with, is my goal for my son or daughter or person that I support, is it mastery or is it exposure? And I always start there. So do I want them to master certain skills before becoming an adult in adult services, or do I want them exposed to as much as possible before that point? And after starting from there, you then work with, okay, I want as much exposure as I can. So I want them to have a volunteer opportunity by the time they're 22. And that's a SMART goal. Or you can say, I want mastery. So I want my son or daughter to master independently using their communication device by the time they're 21. That's a SMART goal. Again, so those are just things that we should think of, is really making sure that it's specific and you have an end date. And for families too, it's a very realistic SMART goal is, I want to tour 5 adult agencies by the time my son or daughter is 21 years old. You should be setting those goals as a family support network as well, not just for the individual we serve. And I think I'll make a couple really quick points. I know we're up against it, so make a couple really quick points on charting the life course, and I'll be done. So charting the life course, again, Carrie mentioned it earlier, it's a great resource. I'm not going to go through, there are other webinars which are more geared towards teaching you how to use charting the life course. There are some resources on the Charting the Life course website on how to use their supports. What I really just want to emphasize is when we're using Charting the Life course or any person-centered planning, we need to triangulate. And this came up in an IEP I was in this morning. Typically, the visions that we have as parents or the visions we have as siblings or individuals can be different. So whenever you're using any of these tools, from my experience, it's great to use them triangulated. And so what that means is you fill it out from different perspectives. I typically give these to schools and say, could you please fill this out for the individual from your perspective? I give it to the parents and say, can you please fill this out from your perspective? And then I put the two together. And I combine them and I say, these are differences that school sees than what the parents see. And then if the individual is able, I ask them to do it for themselves. If the individual isn't able, I try to have a peer help them with it. So I'd either ask the school or a sibling and say, is there a peer that is a friend, or is there someone that's not in a role of really in a direct support role that can do this, someone that's not responsible for the care, but has a different investment in the individual who can also do this. So typically, if we can get 3 perspectives on Trying the Life course, we get the best results from them. So again, we have the integrated STAR. This is just really telling us what the person needs and their strengths. If we go on to the next one, we have my favorite tool from Charting the Life course. So this is the life trajectory, and this is my all-time favorite. It talks about past experiences which have led to negative outcomes and positive outcomes. Future experiences will lead to the same thing, and then what the person enjoys and what they want to do and what didn't work. This isn't comprehensive, but this is the best conversation starter I have with families and ways I know of what to ask them and what to probe so I can get to know them. So going back to the first question, in 1 or 2 meetings, how do you know enough? I don't know enough. But by filling out stuff like this and providing me as much info from different perspectives as you can of your son or daughter, it's the best I can get. I personally read every IEP from when they're about 15 years old until they're 22, which is a lot of information. Gloria, yeah, I'll send, and Carrie has the link directly to charting the life course for all these documents directly. So it's, again, there's no way for me to comprehensively know your son or daughter. I will say before COVID, I knew a lot of families, individuals, much more than I knew the family, because I would visit each school district at least once a month. And whenever I went for an IEP, I'd also observe all the special ed classrooms. So I'd get to know them. I'd see them once a month. I might only have 1 or 2 official meetings with the family, but I would see the individuals. So if they're out of district, again, I'd get to those about every 3 months. But so those are the best ways I can say. Providing information from the family perspective, triangulating all of this information to us. And again, we essentially work for the individual. Yes, we're employed by the state of Massachusetts, but transition coordinators work for the individual. So as much as we can get from families and other support networks, that's what we can do. And we do try our best. And all we ask is families, tell us what you need. That's the biggest takeaway I've had in doing this job for 3 years and being an adult service coordinator before that. I don't know what you need unless you ask. There's too many questions I can ask and it takes too long. If you need something, please ask us and we can do our best to accommodate. If you don't ask and I don't know, we tend to have a very engagements that are more friction filled, which I don't want. And then we're all just kind of assuming someone's has information that they don't have, and that's never good. So please come to your area office, tell us what you need, and tell us what we can do for you so we can really help as much as we can. And yeah, this is just, gotta dream big, set your goals, and take action. It's self-explanatory.
Yeah. Well, thanks, John. And we can certainly, I'll put in the chat around charting the life course, and, just, it's great to kind of do that trajectory before the meeting with DDS, before your meeting with your transition coordinator. And sometimes it's a little fuzzy about what you do want or what the vision is, but so important. I know a lot of individuals and families can really articulate really, really well what they don't want. So starting there is absolutely fine. Anyways, thanks, John. Appreciate that. We are right at 1 o'clock, but we do have more information for you. And what I will be doing is I will be downloading the chat. So if we can't answer every single question, we will get back to you on that. And we'll probably be running more towards 1:15, which was the original plan, because we thought there was so much information, it was going to go over the hour. So I hope you can still be with us. But anyway, so I'm going to kind of take over here and talk about how has, what we've learned today is basically, regardless of COVID, this is the role of the transition coordinator. This is what they're doing. Things, processes, they're still happening. They may be a little slower, but they're happening. And this is what's supposed to be happening. So again, regardless of COVID, what we've learned so far, this is the role and this is what they have done. So now how specifically has COVID-19 impacted transitions? And Erica, I'm wondering if you want to talk about this slide. This is kind of the mantra from the Framingham office, and I'm going to have you present it.
Okay, great. So I guess I just wanted to quickly answer, which ties into this slide, how has COVID-19 changed our transition planning? And so the way that it's changed it is that we see families requiring DDS to shift a little bit too, and they're shifting. So we find that families aren't looking for just a program to replace a program. They're really looking to find what's going to make their individual happy. Now that they've been home and they've spent all this time in lockdown with their families and with their individuals, they're really starting to educate and shift the thinking from a traditional program. So what's happened is I feel as though we've gotten a lot closer with a lot of our families. And so this little picture kind of encapsulates what we've been thinking in our area office, and it's based on an African philosophy called Ubuntu. And the group of the children sitting together is the premise of it. And what happened was an anthropologist put a basket of fruit over by a tree and said, okay, whoever gets there first gets the basket of fruit. And when he said go, all the children grabbed each other's hands and they ran together. And that's them in the circle enjoying the fruit. And when the anthropologist asked them, why did you grab each other's hands and all go together when one could have gotten all of them? And one of them answered back, Ubuntu, how can I be happy if everyone else is sad? So I really feel like, there's been a humanity that's been added to the delivery of our work. And one silver lining in all of this is that, and that closeness. And we've invited Susan Palma here today. She's our support broker, to really talk a little bit about how services has changed during COVID and how her role has really become fun. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Susan Palma. She's our support broker, and she has two cases that she's going to introduce you to. One is that they transitioned during, that they were turning 22 during COVID. And the second one is an individual that was in a community-based day program for 10 years, and he lost his program, and you're going to hear what they did. So we really want to end on an upbeat note, on a positive note, and to kind of give some ideas of what we can do. So thank you, Carrie, and Susan, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Erica. So I work with Erica in the Middlesex West area office, and I know how much time and energy and talents Erica really puts into each transition. So I like to let her know how her former students are doing once they leave working with her and start working with an adult service coordinator, because you do have to say goodbye to your beloved transition coordinators once the students transition into adult services. So I'm a service coordinator and a support broker, and that means that I partner with the individuals and their families that choose the participant-directed program, which is also known as PDP. So the participant-directed program model allows the participants and their families the freedom to really customize the activities that their individuals do to focus on their interests and their needs. And I believe that in all of the service delivery systems, that PDP offers the most flexibility and the most creativity and the most opportunity to truly individualize the services. And those services are actually flexible enough to adjust to almost anything, including a pandemic. So I have Tasha, who turned 22 in May 2020. And if you think changing into adult services is difficult, changing into adult services during a pandemic is very difficult. Everything was shut down, including the day program that Tasha was planning on going to, where she was planning on having one-to-one staffing to support her and prevent the self-injurious behavior, to help her tolerate being told no, and to improve her functional communication. So her mother, Marta, created a program just for her through the participant-directed program. And Marta has seen this as a huge silver lining to COVID. She said the success of Tasha's program really relies on the fact that the self-directed model has enabled her to choose the staff that she really wants to work with Tasha. She hired a board-certified behavior analyst who was familiar with Tasha, who wrote up a behavior plan and helped train Tasha's workers. And many of the workers that she hired actually knew Tasha from previous relationships with her. They sat down and they developed clear, specific objectives for Tasha to work on, but the shift is they let her dictate her schedule, and they worked on the skill building during the activities that Tasha chose. And by giving Tasha more control over her schedule, she was really able to make that link to become invested and to improve her functional communication. And her functional communication improving has really led to a decrease in some of the behaviors that the team was so concerned about. So Marta's quote up there is awesome. I think it says it all. It says, having the team of professionals that we do, we have the capacity to develop a new program in which Tasha can navigate her day with more support to become more independent, to make better choices, and to learn to problem solve and to better self-regulate. I am beyond grateful for the program that the self-directed model has allowed us to design and to implement daily. It constantly improves Tasha's capabilities, promoting her greater quality of life. And Tasha is thriving. And so I know whenever you hear like about the one success story, you think, oh, she's one in a million. She's not, she's amazing. But you know, John mentioned about how you've got short-term goals and long-term goals. And those long-term goals are really leading to your dreams. So I just want to stretch you a little bit. And on the next slide, introduce you to Christopher. Because Christopher, when he was in school, had a lot in common with Tasha. And his mom has been self-directing his participant-directed supports for about 7.5 years. And like Marta, his mom really created a service delivery system that gives Christopher exactly what he needs to be successful. It respects his preferences, it builds on his interests and his strength, and it teaches him the skills that he needs to be the person that he wants to be, which is that long-term dream and that long-term vision. So while you're looking at these amazing pictures, I'm not even going to tell you what his life was like before, just focus on what his life is now and what it's going to be. Because throughout this pandemic, when we were struggling and I was gaining weight, Chris was learning how to mountain bike through the hills and losing weight. So I asked his mom to write something up for us. And she said this: the big change for us was the closure of Chris Day's program. He is a very active young man who needs his schedule and wanted something to do. So because of the participant-directed program, they were able to create a day program which gave Chris a lot more physical activity than he had before. That activity calmed him down and tired him out. And 1 year later, he is stronger, he has greater endurance, he's 20 pounds lighter, and he is incredibly happy. She said that they have a lot more flexibility in Chris choosing what he does every day. He takes advantage of the good weather. He participates in activities in his community. And the longer periods of time has allowed him to go on 15-mile bike rides, to learn how to bake bread, which I think was a mandatory activity during the pandemic, that everyone learned how to make their bread. He's also made pasta. He makes pizzas. He's gone hiking. He's gone kayaking. He's gone swimming. And the other benefit of the participant-directed program during the pandemic is they were able to really limit the activities that he had to a tight group of people, so that his caregivers had less of a chance of spreading COVID, and Christopher was safer. So I just want to let you know, keep Christopher in mind and keep Tasha in mind as you go through this somewhat scary transition process, and see some really solid silver linings at the end if you keep focusing on those big dreams and work with your team.
Well, thank you, Susan. Those were very, very inspiring. There was a couple of chats that said that as well. So let me advance a slide. We have a couple more things to talk about. We have a couple of the area offices talks about turning 22, and I have a video which I'm hoping will play. Okay, let me share my sound. We have Lauren King from the Metro North area office, and she's going to talk a little bit about turning 22 and what's been happening there. So I'm hoping I can get this video going on. If not, she also wrote some bullets. One thing that I noted that they're doing, and sorry, I keep flipping the screen, is that they're one of their agencies is actually providing in-home a couple days a week, not every day, and not, you know, for a full day, but for a few hours. So two to three times a week, which has been helpful. So I think, you know, I mean, some of these lessons are that, you know, thinking outside the box, working with your transition coordinator and the area office can be so helpful in terms of like, okay, this really is not okay for my kid right now. And really kind of brainstorming what can be done about it. So it's, you know, nothing works for everybody, but you know, helpful to look at some of these situations. And so I am going to hand it over to Erica to kind of talk about what's going on in Middlesex West.
Okay.
And then we can take a couple questions and then take it from there.
Great. Okay, and I'll be nice and quick. But essentially, since COVID, we've tried to be more accessible in that self-direction model because we had to pivot because of all the day programs being closed. So one great resource is that Jennifer Benoit is our regional self-direction manager, and she offers self-direction regional forums. So we'd love to send those forums and those dates and times, and you can certainly ask us for those on when they're available. We've simplified the delivery of self-direction. We've tried to make it a little easier for families to access, and Susan and I do orientations together. And within 2 meetings, we feel as though you'll have a great handle on potentially if this is a program that you want to do. We have worked closely with our agency with choice providers, and they're at the ready. So we're able to connect families quickly with agency with choice if they determine that's a model that they're interested in. And one thing we do is we do a 90-day orientation. So within the first 90 days of a family becoming eligible, we will meet with that family and we'll provide an overview of DDS services, and that has seemed to help too. So those are just a couple of things that we're doing, and I want to leave more time for questions. So Carrie, thank you, and I'll turn it right back to you.
Thanks, Erica. So I think we can chat. Let's look at the chat and see what we have here. See what we haven't answered.
Carrie, I can go back. I copied all the
positives
questions
here.
into a separate document.
I'm sorry, what?
I copied all the questions that came through into a separate document, so I can just go through and read them off, and that's easier than scrolling back.
Okay.
All right. And Aaron and Erica, I'll try to direct them towards your section, just so we can do that. So Erica, during your section, a question that was asked, which I answered in chat, but we'd love your input, is just simply, is the ITP a formal document?
Yes, the ITP is a formal document, and it is, again, connected to that 688. So by law, we need to have an ITP meeting. So it is a formal document, but it's not a document that says that these services have to take place. It's a document to say that that conversation took place with the team.
Perfect. I'll answer this one. There was a question about any parents who successfully did self-direction and they're willing to mentor or support groups. I highly suggest, if that's something you're interested in, to join your area office's CAB. That is the Citizens Advisory Board. And that is a group of parents that really help lead the direction of your area office. So if you want to see that happen, go to the CAB meetings. The area director or assistant area director runs them in every office. It's a great networking among parents who are very active in the community and very great advocates. I highly suggest going through the CAB. If you scroll back through the chats, there are a couple other suggestions of people who might help facilitate. But again, every parent I have that comes to me with that question, I tell them, reach out to my area director, join the CAB, and none of them have been disappointed in that.
John, the support brokers also have a list of parents who are willing to volunteer and mentor new parents. So the transition coordinators can hook you up with that if they want to have a conversation parent to parent.
The next question is, who holds the ITP meeting? Again, Erica.
Sure. So the ITP meeting is a meeting that your transition coordinator will chair. But again, it's really nice to embed it right into that IEP meeting because it's the perfect flow. As they're talking about what the individual is benefiting from at that time, we can then just expand and think about post-22. So it's the transition coordinator that chairs those meetings, but often it's embedded in an IEP.
Out of sake of time, I'll skip over the ones that I answered separate. But again, this is a good one. And Victor Hernandez was on this call prior, and he is not anymore. But again, for families that are looking at compensatory services, we have been instructed to plan as if they're transitioning at 22. It is not going to affect the needs. Victor Hernandez and Chris Klaskin are Odbudson. They have all met with all of the transition coordinators. We are well aware of the regulations being put out by DESC and DDS. And we actually report any individual case that is getting compensatory services past 22 directly to central office. So we have plenty of guidance. We've been told to plan as if they're transitioning at 22. But again, they get brought up to central office. Our area directors are aware. So really they're so unique. And Victor met with us recently. There's a very small number of families that are accessing that right now. But we are aware, and we're planning for the needs. That's our role. We work for the individual. So whatever's best for them. If it's best for them to put off a day program to get their entitlement services, continue that, and we'll figure out another way. And they're not going to lose anything because of that. I think that's very important to know. If that's a plan, we know what's happening. We're not surprised by it. So again, I know there's a lot of advocacy and a lot of legal action around that. So again, we tend to defer that back to central office whenever it comes up. And again, I suggest families do the same. Talk to the area directors, bring it up to regional, but we are aware, and we do have plans in place for it. It's just, again, they're very unique. It's something that's a work in progress. Let's see, I think this next section comes from you, Aaron. Yeah, this came up during your section, but it's not specific, but how do you find a list of the family support centers or the support services?
Sure. So, yeah, so again, there is a corresponding family support center to every DDS area office. Again, sometimes your school contacts may know who that family support center is, which private nonprofit agency holds that DDS contract. If they're not sure, again, my suggestion, as John and Erica both sort of, and myself reiterated, communicate directly with your area office. Don't be intimidated by just giving us a call and asking, because that's what we're here for. And that's what the Family Support Center is there for too. So again, don't be afraid to reach out to the area office and ask those questions. And there is, to make it clear, there is a family support directory as well. Many of the local providers maintain those lists, but there's also on our website as well a directory, and I think we can probably forward that as well.
So I only count a few more questions, so this one back to you, Erica. What do the families and coordinators do if the ITP determines what a client would benefit from is not available? I guess the concern is, do they sit at home until something becomes available, and who notifies the family that their requests are not happening at that time?
So I guess an example of that would be all the ITPs that we generated before COVID, and then COVID hit, and we might have identified that an individual would benefit from a structured community-based aid program, but then they all closed down. And this is where that piece of DDS services really delineates from entitlement services. So it's based on need and availability. So if a program is not available, it's not available. So what do? We're doing what Susan kind of talked about and what we're talking about in terms of silver linings. We're really trying to figure out how can we assist. And in some ways we've been able to do that through family support centers, through stipends, and having families, potentially hire someone to work with their individual a few hours a week to maybe maintain those skills. But really, COVID and shutting programs down, there has been a lot of individuals that have been home despite, maybe what their ITP has said.
I'll jump in with the next question. What happens if a client's money allocation for services goes unused? That just doesn't happen. All the money in DDS goes used. We don't have leftovers at the end. We run in the negative every year, and all of our area directors are extremely creative to make things spread. So it just doesn't happen. So specifically, we're talking COVID. So what if they turned 22 during COVID and didn't start their day program? Ask your area office what they're doing. Again, I know in my office, I'm doing a different service that I can code for, whether, like Erica said, it be an in-home support or a self-directed program, just to make sure you don't lose any resource. But again, ask your area office specifically. Aaron, do you want to address this one? It's when does the transition coordinator hand off the case after the transition? And following with that, do they have any continued involvement was a follow-up question.
Sure. So again, it's important to kind of view a question like that through the lens of the specific area office. You know, things do vary slightly office to office, but for the intents and purposes of this webinar, the transition service coordinator's caseload is age specific. So when those ages are 18 to 22. So that's kind of would be the appropriate tenure for a transition coordinator. They're going to be sort of the liaison between the school and adult world for you. And they're the ones, again, that are giving you the information, the education, and overseeing the transition. And then once the transition happens, making sure that everyone's sort of acclimating well, resting easy, so on and so forth. So once an individual is sort of firmly nestled in adult services, then there typically sort of triggers a transfer of knowledge to start to happen between the transition service coordinator and an adult service coordinator, who will be sort of the more indefinite point of contact for your son or daughter going forward. And that would be sort of the primary point person for you indefinitely, as long as your son or daughter kind of wants to continue to capture the services, and the adult service coordinator will be the one sort of setting up the first individual service plan that John mentioned, and then every year, therefore, after that as well. So again, typically the timeline for the first ISP is about 45 to 60 days. So within that month or so, month and a half, you can kind of expect the transition of the transition coordinator to start happening.
And just to add on to that, I know every transition coordinator does things differently. But Bethany Doherty, I'll answer your question in a second. But yeah, so we all do it differently. I personally, I try checking with as many families as possible. It's very hard with the amount of people we have in Merrimack Valley. We hold the second highest caseload in the state. I try checking with as many as I can at 6 months. It's a way to make sure that stuff I recommend or stuff that I thought happened is consistent with what the agencies are telling me at the time. And I use that to be better for families to come. I don't have any role. I just check in and say, how's it going? And then after that 6 months, I typically disappear. Bethany Doyle, so if a person with ASD transitions before 22, the adult service coordinator would take over sooner. This is a tricky one. Depends on your area office, but most area offices right now, for ASD only, your ASD coordinator also does transition. There are a couple area offices where the 688 coordinator does the transition, but they're very, very few. So call your area office, ask if you have an ASD coordinator or a 688 coordinator. If they're 688, they'll transition like Aaron's timeline, you know, within 45 to 60 days after they're done. If they have an ASD coordinator, that coordinator should stay with them long-term from transition into adulthood.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I think so. I'm looking at the time and we're way over. I so appreciate you hanging in there, folks. And Susan, John, Erica, and Aaron, thanks for a great presentation. Really thorough. You know, I know a lot of people kind of probably knew the basics, but it's really refreshing to know what are the things that you guys can assist with and continue to assist with. And then what are some, unique situations that COVID did bring us. So, and I wanted to thank all of you who came today. And like I said, we will send you the PDF of the PowerPoint. And also I will send you that timelines that Aaron put together, as well as I'll send you the transition timelines from ARC of Massachusetts, because they very helpful. So thanks all for hanging in there. I hope you all have a great day, and look for the recording in about a week or so. So, all righty. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.